Early on in Robert Olen Butler's novel, Mr. Spaceman, the narrator, Desi, tries to understand the human condition. He says, "I am far above. I wait. I have at my disposal the wonders of modern technology. I can see everything, hear everything. I am as those on this planet who truly believe in a widely dispirited universe can call me a spaceman." Desi is an alien, the only remaining member of his species, and he is collecting the memories and yearnings of a few special individuals to take with him aboard his great vessel. Much like his protagonist, Robert Olen Butler is also an observer, a collector. He inhabits his narrators with the precision of an alien autopsy, unraveling layer after layer of compassion, truth, and tragedy. Like Desi, he sees everything, hears everything. The Boston Book Review called him a master of enveloping his reader in the consciousness of a character, and Publishers Weekly said that his writing was endlessly playful, inventive, and daring. Robert Olen Butler has published 16 novels and 6 collections of short stories, and his lectures on the creative process have been collected in the landmark work From Where You Dream, a necessary read for anyone serious about writing fiction. His works have appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, Esquire, The Atlantic Monthly, and they have also been chosen for annual anthologies such as the Best American Short Stories and the O. Henry Awards. He is a Francis Epps Distinguished Professor in Creative Writing at Florida State University, a recipient of both a Guggenheim Fellowship and a National Endowment for the Arts grant. Robert Olen Butler has also won a small, rather quaint award called the Pulitzer Prize. We are honored to have him spend his night with us here and to share in his work. Please join me in welcoming the 2016 Boyle lecturer, Robert Olen Butler.
The Pulitzer Prize sounds like a chicken dish, doesn't it? I'm delighted to be here at Spring Hill College. Thank you, Michael, one of my star students from back at Florida State University. I had a great session with some of your young writers here today, and a fascinating conversation, too fascinating perhaps, with your faculty. It's just a real delight to be here. And I'm going to spend the first 35 minutes or maybe a bit more. You will be, in fact, the second group, and you're quite a bit larger than the first group, which was in Taos, Mexico a few weeks ago. You will be amongst the first couple of hundred people ever to hear anything from my new novel, which is coming out in September. It's called Perfume River. And after I read it, I'll be happy to talk to you about anything you're interested in asking questions about. I'm going to read you from the very beginning of the novel, so I'm not going to tell you too much. Let the book introduce itself. If I have to tell you something, I've made a big mistake somewhere in there. What are Robert Quinlan and his wife feebly arguing about when the homeless man slips quietly in? Moments later, Robert could hardly have said Obamacare or Quinoa or their granddaughter's new boyfriend. Something. He and Darla are sitting at a table in the dining area of the New Leaf Co-op. Her back is to the man. Robert is facing him. He notices him instantly, though the man is making eye contact with none of the scattered few of them, the health-conscious members of the co-op dining by the pound from the hot buffet. It's a chilly North Florida January twilight, and he's still clearly overbundled, perhaps from the cold drilling deeper into his bones because of a life lived mostly outside. Or perhaps he simply needs to carry all his clothes around with him. Robert takes him for a veteran. The man's shoulder-length hair is shrapnel gray, His face is deep creased and umbered by street life. But in spite of the immediately apparent state of his present situation, he stands straight with his shoulders squared. He sits down at a table beside the partitioned doorway, which gapes into the crosswise aisle between checkout counters and front entrance. He slumps forward ever so slightly and puts both hands clenched into fists on the tabletop. He stares at them. "You should have put your curry on it," Darla says to Robert. "So it's about quinoa," the argument. "Instead of rice," she says. She has continued her insistent advocacy while his attention has drifted over her shoulder to the bed. Robert brings his eyes back to her. He tries to remember if he has already cited the recent endorsement of white rice by some health journal or other. "All those famously healthy Japanese eat rice," he says. She huffs. He looks at his tofu curry on the biodegradable paper plate. He looks back to the vet, who has opened one fist and is placing a small collection of coins on the table. "I'm just trying to keep you healthy," Darla says. "Which is why I am content to be here at all," Robert says, though he keeps his eyes on the vet. The man opens the other fist and begins pushing his coins around, sorting them. It is done in a small, quiet way. No show about it at all. "Thanks to their fish," she says. Robert returns to Darla. Her eyes are the cerulean blue of a Monet sky. "Fish?" he asks, uncomprehendingly. "Yes," she says, "that's the factor." He leans toward her, perhaps a bit too abruptly. She stops her explanation and her blue eyes widen a little. "I should feed him," he says, low. She blinks and gathers herself. "Who?" He nods in the vet's direction. She peeks over her shoulder. The man is still pushing his coins gently around. She leans to Robert, lowering her voice. "I didn't see him. He just came in," Robert says. "Feed him quinoa," Darla says. She isn't kidding. "Please," he says, rising. She shrugs. This isn't a thing Robert often does. Never with money. He carries the reflex attitude learned in childhood. You give a guy like this money and it will go for drink, which just perpetuates his problems. There are organizations he can find if he really wants to take care of himself. Giving food is another matter, he figures. But to give food to somebody you encounter on the street while rafting the momentum of your daily life, that's usually an awkward thing to pull off. And so, in those rare cases when it wouldn't be awkward, you can easily overlook the chance. But here's a chance he's noticed. And there's something about this guy that continues to suggest veteran, which is to say, Vietnam veteran. Something. He is of an age, of a certain bearing, of a field radio frequency that you are always tuned to in your head. Robert is a veteran. He doesn't go straight for the vet's table. He heads toward the doorway, which would bring him immediately alongside him. He draws near. The man has finished arranging his coins, but continues to ponder them. He does not look up. Then Robert is beside him, as if about to pass through the doorway. The vet has to be aware of him now. Still he does not look. He has no game going in order to get something, this man of needs. It has truly been about sorting the coins. He smells a little musty, but not overpoweringly so. He's taking care of himself pretty well, considering, or has done so recently at least. Robert stops. The vet's hair, which was a cowl of gray from across the room, up close has a seam of coal black running from crown to collar. Robert puts his hand on the man's shoulder. He bends near him. The man is turning, lifting his face, and Robert says, "Would you like some food?" Their eyes meet. The furrows of the vet's face at brow and cheek and jaw retain much of their first impression, deeply defined from hard times and a hard life in the body. But his eyes seem clear, and they crimp now at the outer edges. "Yes," he says, "do you have some?" "I can get you some," Robert says. "That would be good," the man says. "Yes." "What do you like?" "I think there was some chicken." Though he hasn't invoked the preternaturally healthful quinoa, he catches himself trying to manage this guy's nutrition, an impulse which feels uncomfortably familiar. He's trying to get him healthy. "It needs to be soft," the man says. "I don't have very many teeth." "Why don't you come with me?" Robert says. "You can choose." The vet is quick to his feet. "Thank you," he says. He offers a closed-mouth smile. Standing with him now, about to walk with him, Robert recognizes something he's neglected. This act is still blatant charity, condescending in its anonymity. So he offers his hand, and though he almost always calls himself and always thinks of himself as Robert, he says, "Bob." The vet hesitates. The name alone seems to have thrown him. Robert clarifies, "I'm Bob." The man takes Robert's hand and smiles again, more broadly this time, but struggling to keep his toothlessness from showing. "I'm Bob," he says. And then hastily, as if he'd be mistaken for simply madly parroting the name, "Two." The handshake goes on. The vet has a firm grip. He further clarifies, "I'm also Bob." "It's a good name," Robert says. "It's okay. Not as common as it used to be." Bob looks at Robert for a moment, letting the handshake slow and stop. Robert senses a shifting of the man's mind into a conversational gear that hasn't been used in a while. "That's true," Bob says. Robert leads him through the doorway and along the partition, past the 10 items only register and into the buffet area. He stops at the soup warmers on the end cap, thinking of the man's tooth problem. But Bob goes on ahead, and before Robert can make a suggestion, Bob says, "They have beans and rice. This is good." Robert steps beside him, and together they peer through the sneeze guard at a tub of pintos and a tub of brown rice. Good mess hall food, Robert thinks. Though thinking of it that way jars with a reassessment going on in a corner of his mind, of no relevance to this present intention, however. Bob declines any other food, and Robert piles one of the plastic dinner plates high with beans and rice, while Bob finds a drink in the cooler. Robert waits for him and takes the bottle of lightly lemon sparkling water from his hand and says, "Why don't you go ahead and sit?" Bob nods and slips away. Robert steps to the nearby checkout station. A young man with a jugular sunburst tattoo and a silver ring pierced into his lip totals up the food, and Robert lets his reassessment register in his mind. From the clues of age in face and hair, Robert realizes Bob is no Vietnam veteran. As old as the man is, perhaps 50 or 55, he's still too young to have been in Vietnam. He missed it by a decade or so. Robert pays. The clerk gives him a small, understanding nod. "Do you know him?" Robert asks. "He comes now and then," the young man says. Beans and rice and fizzy lemon water in hand, Robert turns away. He steps into the dining area and sets the plate and the can before Bob. The man has carefully laid out his napkin and plastic utensils and has put his coins away. He squares around to look up at Robert. He is not the man Robert first thought him to be. "Thank you," Bob says. Robert knows nothing about him. "It's a good meal," Bob says. "You bet," Robert says, and he moves off, thinking, it would have made no difference. I would have done this anyway. He sits down before Darla. She leans toward him and says softly, I'm glad you did that. To her credit, she does not ask what he's bought the band. She sits back. Her plate, once featuring the spicy Thai quinoa salad, is empty. He looks at his remaining tofu curry. He picks up his fork and begins pushing it around. She says something he does not quite hear. He stops pushing. There are other voices in the dining area, conversations. He thinks, can it have been that long ago? But of course it can. Even consciously thinking about it, Vietnam yields up no clear individual memory. Images are there, faces and fields and a headquarters compound courtyard and a bar and a bed and a river. But they are like thumbnails of forgotten snaps on a cell phone screen. More, Darla says, as part of other things she's been saying, no doubt. Robert looks at her. She narrows her eyes at him. It's probably cold, she says, nodding at his food. Probably, he says. You can get some more, she says. I don't need anything, he says. She shrugs. Shall we go? Coffee, he says. The word is a nanosecond or so ahead of the conscious thought. She cocks her head. He went back to the stuff a few months ago after she'd wrangled a year of abstinence from him. She was reconciled to it, but the one-word announcement sounds like a taunt, he realizes. Bob needs some coffee, he says. Bob. She twists at the word in her snorty voice, assuming he's referring to his coffee-seeking self in the third person. She occasionally calls him Bob when she thinks he's behaving badly. He doesn't explain. He rises. He approaches Bob. The man is hunched over his food, wolfing it in. Robert is beside him before he looks up. You a coffee drinker, Bob? I surely am, he says. How do you take it? With a splash of milk. I'll get you some. I appreciate it, Bob, Bob says. Near the buffet, Robert begins to fill a cup from a percolator urn. Framed in the center of the urn is the bag art for today's brew. An upsweep of mountains dense with tropical forest, the vista framed in coffee trees. Somewhere along the highway to Dak To, they'd laid out the beans to dry. He is passing in a jeep, heading to an assignment that will quickly be changed, sending him up country. A pretty-faced girl in a conical hat, leaning on her coffee rake, lifts her face to him, and he sweeps on past. The cup is nearly full. He flips up the handle. He splashes in some milk. He returns to Bob. The man thanks him again, briefly cupping both hands around the coffee, taking in its warmth before setting it down. You a Floridian, Bob? Robert asks. I'm from Charleston, West Virginia, he says. Good thing you're not up there for the winter. Bob nods a single firm nod and looks away. I have to go back, he says. Perhaps when things warm up. No choice, he says. I've got responsibilities. His face remains averted. He isn't elaborating. His beans and rice are getting cold. Robert still has the urge to make this encounter count for something beyond a minor act of charity. Learn a bit more about him. Offer some advice, whatever. And this is all he can think to ask. What sort of responsibilities, Bob? Bob doesn't look at him. He doesn't eat. He doesn't drink. Robert has made the man go absolutely still. But Robert sloughs off a niggle of guilt, thinking, He's probably been asserting these responsibilities to himself for the whole long slide to where he is now, knowing there's nothing left where he came from, knowing he'll never go back. Robert puts his hand on Bob's shoulder for a moment and then moves away. He does not sit down at their table. Darla looks up. She glances at his empty hands. No coffee? He shrugs. She nods and smiles. Finished with dinner? Yes, he says. She gathers her things and they put on their coats. She leads the way across the floor. Darla may well glance at Bob as she passes, ready to offer him an encouraging smile. She would do that. But Bob looks up only after she's gone by. He fixes his eyes on Robert's and upticks his chin. He says, "You know my old man, is that it?" Robert takes the odd abruptness of the question in stride, answering a passing no as he follows Darla out of the dining area. And that is that. Darla and Robert are finished in town, and he drives toward home on the Parkway. The two of them do not speak. This is not uncommon after dining out. They live east and south of the Tallahassee city limits, on an acre of garden and hardwood, and a dozen more of softwood, and the quickest way carries them first along a commercial scroll of strip malls and chain eateries, lube joints and furniture stores, pharmacies and gas stations. Robert finds himself acutely aware of all this. He turns south at his first opportunity, and then, shortly, he turns east again onto Old St. Augustine Road. Darla humphs. Though for all their years together, she has alternately used this dismissive sound as a sign of approval. It is up to him to know which humph is which. Old St. Augustine is easy to interpret, canopied in live oaks and hiding its residences and smattering of service commerce behind sweet gums and hickories and tulip poplars. This is a road from the state's past, a subject he occasionally teaches at the university, and Darla occasionally is happy to hear him discourse upon, though their silence persists tonight. She switches on the university radio station. This same ostinato of orchestral strings presses his face to a window of a TWA 707. The Rocky Mountains crawl beneath him. He is flying to Travis Air Force Base, north of San Francisco. From there, he will go to war. And this music is playing in his head through pneumatic headsets. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. The first movement has tripped and stomped and danced, making things large as Beethoven can do, but confidently so, almost lightly so, a little bit of the summer pastoral spilling over from the Sixth Symphony. And now in the second movement, the largeness of things is rendered into reassuring repetitions. Can Robert believe this of what lies ahead of him? This grave contentment the music would have him feel? He is not to be a shooting soldier. He will do order of battle work, rather like research, rather like the things he learned to love in his recent 4 years at Tulane. Wherever they put him, he will be bunkered in at the core of a headquarters compound. It would take an unlikely military cataclysm, or a fluke, a twist of very bad luck, a defiance of the actuarial reality of warfare that is obscured by Cronkite's nightly report, for him to die. He is young enough to feel confident in that reasoning. It is September of 1967, 4 months before the military cataclysm of the coming Vietnam New Year, Tet, 1968. And if he does survive, he believes he will earn a thing he has long yearned to earn, foreshadowed only a few days ago in a bar on Magazine Street. His father shed tears over his 10th farewell Dixie, Robert's 4th, silent tears. William Quinlan, has always been a quiet drunk, a quiet man, about feelings he could not command, feelings better felt by women. Robert still thinks, as he flies away to music his father could never understand, that he knows what the tears were about. In the car, however, this ostinato is solemn and insistent, more than solemn. It aches. He feels nothing like contentment as he races through the corridor of oaks. It is 47 years later. He glances at Darla. Her face is pressed against the window. Later, lying beside each other in bed before they complete their nightly ritual, Darla says, "What did you two talk about?" "Who?" he says, though he knows who she means. "The homeless man," she says. "The weather," he says. "Did he say how he copes?" "We didn't get into that." "I hate to shrug him off," she says, though in an intonation that mutes the hate and stresses the off. She therefore does not need to add, "but we must." They say no more. Darla inserts her iPod earbuds, and she and Robert switch off their lamps. Their Kindles have their own light. The tinny spill of Bach from his wife's ears fades quickly from Robert's awareness. Soon, however, he is reading the same few sentences over and over. He turns off his book. "Good night," she says, aware of the vanishing of his light in her periphery. "Good night," he says, though they have long ago agreed that the formality of this reply is unnecessary, since her head at this point is always full of music and she cannot hear him. Nor do they kiss. They are so very familiar with each other, and that familiarity has become the presiding expression of their intimacy. But before Robert lets go to sleep, he wonders what the man is doing right now. There is some shelter or other in Tallahassee, surely. Bob is there. Perhaps he is thinking still of Charleston, thinking of whatever it is he feels responsible for. Or perhaps Robert was right about that sudden stillness in Bob. Perhaps the man is merely hunkered down for the night in this life he's drifted to, trying to figure out how he got here. After the man and his wife passed and vanished, and Bob got reacquainted with the food and the coffee before him, and after he ate and drank and sat for a while at the table, he has once again forgotten what he knows about what can set him to thinking. Forgotten this to his severe detriment, since he does not want to deal with the inside of his mind, with the thinking machine revved up, not ever, but especially not at the very same time as having to deal with finding a place to sleep, now that he's missed the deadlines for the shelters and the missions and the lighthouses and the mercy houses of the promised lands and the heavenly refuges. But tonight he has forgotten what he knows about the situation. So, as soon as he remembers, he stands and goes out of the New Leaf Market, and it's too late. The situation is upon him. It was light, and now it's dark. It happened while he wasn't watching. It happened quick. It launches him along Appalachia Parkway, and for a long while he just focuses on pushing his body hard to get away. Push and push. That's all there is. Too much. The ache in his legs and his back starts it all aching in his head again. He doesn't know how far he's come, how long he's been walking. A couple of miles, maybe more. Then a landmark tells him he's making progress, even as it stirs up issues. Tillotson Funeral Home passes. Its phony columns flood-lit like the Capitol building. Its marquee making some dead body famous for being dead. Some stiff named Henry tonight. Henry something or other. The second name, not even worth Bob noticing. This guy doesn't matter. Some Henry who was breathing and then he wasn't. The dark continues to nag at Bob. Its suddenness happened early, it being the first week of January. It left a bad chill behind, which is why he's been walking east as fast as he can. In January, he cannot simply vanish into the urban woodlands of Tallahassee, follow a bike trail, and then veer off into the woods and find his things in a place only he knows about. Through a culvert and along a drain bed and up a bank to a mark on a tree, here and a mark on a tree, there and a few more marks, and a fallen oak and a hollow beneath. A place that was good for him all autumn long, and he could go there anytime, no matter how his flailing mind was trying to fuck with him. And he could get his stuff, and he could find a place to sleep in the woods. All of this is rushing in Bob again, filling his head with words. But he never thinks it's somebody else's voice. It's me, it's just me in here. He says this aloud. He's not crazy. He knows to look around right away to see if anybody heard him, and nobody has. Bob's doing fine, with only cars whisking past. No people, no one to hear. He even has the presence of mind to walk against the traffic in the stretches without sidewalks. He's not crazy. He can even circle back to his previous thought, the one before the little digression that was worth mouthing. I can always find my way in the woods, he says. You were okay with me there. Not that you'd let on, but you didn't fool me. I knew you were okay with me there. This he addresses to his father. But Bob's not crazy. Bob doesn't think the old man is there with him on Appalachia Parkway to hear. The old man is just a memory to him. Maybe hiding out in Charleston and yellowing from his liver, or maybe spotlighted this very night in front of some funeral home. But he's nowhere nearby to hear. Nevertheless, because he's not crazy, Bob shuts his trap and does his talking in his head. Where you always are. But when I'm strong, and I'm strong tonight, I know I am, in spite of the situation, I can make you behave. In my head, I can take us into the woods, just you and me, and I can make it be the summer of '71, a certain day in August, and I've gone and turned 12. And that was when I learned about the thing you didn't want me to know, that I was okay by you, though it was only with the Mossberg 22 in the crook of my arm. That I was okay with the Mossberg going quick to my shoulder and I killed some animal or other that you didn't even see. And it makes you drop into a shooting crouch and lay down some covering fire, and then you stop and you look me wild in the eyes, and inside you're going, who the fuck are you? And then you focus and you answer your own question in your head. You don't want me to see it, but I do. I listen into your head and you go, you're Bobby, you're my son. And you can shoot, by God. I've been gone away a big chunk of your life to shoot in some big woods and some fucking jungles in Vietnam, and I come back and by damn, you could use a rifle just as good as any of the boys I've been with. Then you look where I shot, and you throw a camouflage tarp over the crack that just opened and shut in your head, and you jump up, and you're not talking. Not saying a word, of course not. You're not looking at me, but I know what's just passed between us. No matter how you try to camouflage it, I know this thing about the two of us. God damn you, I know it, Bob says. I know it here in the woods, even though I will doubt it when we get back home tonight. You will have your way with my head when you've got us in your single wide and you're in your lazy boy and you've got your bottle and your silence is just your silence. And I better stay out of arm's reach while you're sitting there dealing with whatever it is you came home with a couple of years ago. Your situation. Like Bob has a situation, like now. Like this long, cold walk he's on tonight, trying the one thing he knows to try, concerning a place to sleep, a church building along the Parkway, maybe 30 minutes by foot east of Walmart, an hour and a half from New Leaf, and longer still from the Hard Luckers center of town. And as he pushes on east, Bob can't stay in the woods in his head with his father for all that time. In fact, his mind has already grabbed him up and galloped into that trailer park along the Quinoa, out past the West Virginia State campus, out where he's not okay with his father at all. And even if Bob summons up enough energy to at least drive his mind forward to when he's older, to when he's near as tall and rangy as his dad, and he can easily fend off the old man when he wants to reach out and give his son a slap, it wasn't about that, really. Those slaps were all open-handed, always. Bob knew all along there were worse fathers by far. Even when Bob skips forward, his mind only roars louder because his real fear had to do with whatever it was inside his father that only the old man could see, the things he never talked about. Bob was afraid those things were inside himself already, no matter if his father found them in a jungle halfway around the world, because the two of them were the same, father and son. They were stretched tall in body in the same way. They had the same hands and eyes, and they were the same by that shared thing in the woods when they were together, okay together. Okay together. And the okayness only made everything worse, because that was never spoken about either. Just like the Vietnam jungle stuff. The good things between them and the bad things that could come to men like the two of them were all one in the same unspeakable place. And so Bob tries to just walk. He just strides hard and lets the pain of the pavement pound through his joints and back and temples and gums, and he focuses on what's ahead. A pastor out here at Blood of the Lamb Full Gospel leaves the outside door to the groundskeeper's storage room unlocked on cold nights. They have a food pantry, but this far out of town, they do hard luck families mostly, not the individually lost. Out here, sheltered floor space next to a John Deere is a private little bit of charity by the good pastor that often goes unused. It's being attractive only to a hard lucker without a car, which makes it a pretty good bet to be available to anyone ready to walk 6 or 7 miles, especially since the space is needed most when it's the most daunting to walk, in the cold or in the rain. 2 nights ago it was cold and Bob had the place to himself. It was a hard walk. Tonight it's cold again, but at the moment, with some things talked over, he feels pretty good. Pretty damn good. He's got today's newspaper folded in his pocket, a full copy abandoned on a table, waiting for him as he finished his coffee tonight. There's a light in the storage room to read by. He's not afraid to read the news. The meal and the coffee are sitting well in him, so his thoughts turn to the man who gave them to him, the man with the same name as his, the rangy older man with the John Wayne jaw. You said at first, my name, and I thought for a second you somehow already knew I'm Bob, and it turns out you're Bob, and my father is Calvin. My father isn't Bob. If you were my father, I'd be Junior, and I don't know what I'd think about that. I think I wouldn't like it, not at all. My father is Calvin, Cal. My mother is Marie. And what did you mean, Bob, about my having responsibilities in Charleston? Did you know me there? You another of my old man's cronies, are you? What do you want me to do about it? I never met you before in my life, Bob says. He stops walking. He's not feeling so good now. Things are suddenly getting a little out of hand. He realizes that. This was a good man he met, Bob the stranger. He needs to stop his mind. He needs to sleep. The church isn't much farther. He walks on, and the street lights are gone. They've been gone for a while, and the dark is even darker, but Bob hasn't noticed till now. Still, it's all right. He's reconciled to the dark for this night, and up ahead now is an upspray of light as if rising from the earth, beaconing a message on another marquee before the Blood of the Lamb Full Gospel Church. God answers email. Somehow this calms Bob for a time. Hardly from the sentiment, but he's not only not crazy, he's pretty smart. His mother was smart. Cal was too, in a shrewd sort of way. When Bob's mind is flailing with deep issues, to hear deep issues turned into banality is a kind of mental speed bump for him. He slows down. He gives the sign the finger as he goes by, and he finds he can focus now for a time, and he keeps his eyes lowered as he passes the central spire and the front fake columns on a stuccoed facade. He keeps his face down, and he moves through the side parking lot and around back into the separate community building and around to the back of that and to the door, and he's glad now it's almost over. He will sleep. He can sleep. He is at the door, and he puts his hand to the knob, and he turns it, and the knob yields, and then the door, and he steps into a darkness smelling of cedar mulch and motor oil, and he stops, and he waits a moment for his eyes to adjust, and he sees a swift movement of shadow out of the corner of his eye, and hears a guttural bark of a voice, and he hears nothing more, not even the clang of the shovel against his forehead. That's all I'm going to read to you. Needless to say, there's much more. Bob will be okay, don't worry. He's an important character in the rest of this book. So that's Perfume River. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have about any matter whatsoever. Stunned into silence. Excellent. Most excellent. That's what I was hoping for. Yes.
I have a question. Being this familiar with the good scent from Strange Mountain, your aromatic titles are sort of interesting. Does scent have any particular resonance for you?
Question was, with her familiarity with my book of short stories, the Pulitzer book, Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, whether scent has some particular significance to me. Well, no more than in these two books. I've written 23 books, so no more in these than other senses. At the heart of my aesthetic is the consciousness that literature, the literary art form is no different from a painting or a symphony or a ballet, any other art form. It is an object first and foremost of the senses. We only get deceived by, the way in which it's so easy to teach literature from the mind, translating sensual objects into theme and symbol and abstraction and theory and philosophy and sociology, anthropology, whatever. And all of that is marginally useful in certain ways. But these are art objects. The aesthetic response, which we've lost track of in our culture, is how we're meant to respond to a work of literature, just like any other art form. And so all of the senses are important to me. In these two books, smell is one of them. Since I've raised these issues, maybe I better explicate a little bit. The one thing I have to teach, I've been teaching creative writing for 37 years to people who aspire to create graduate programs, create art. First thing I have to teach them, reteach them, is that art does not come from the mind. Art does not come from the rational, analytical faculties. Art comes from the place where you dream, from your unconscious. And they are rendered in the moment through the senses. And the confusing thing is that all the other art forms, their prime material, their media, movement and dance and sound and music and color and form and painting, no matter how much those writers, those artists think about their art, and they can mess up their art by thinking too much even still, but no matter how much they think and talk, and no matter how much those objects are taught in art appreciation courses of various kind, or music appreciation courses, by analyzing it and turning it into thought and technique, that when they sit down to compose or paint or choreograph, the media are irreducibly sensual. The object is inevitably, even what we call abstract art isn't abstract at all. You stand in front of a large Barnett Newman painting in the Museum of Modern Art, and unless you've been screwed up by too many art appreciation courses, you're not thinking about anything. It's color and texture. It's sensual. Literary art is exactly the same way. We are meant to thrum to a work of art, literary art, in the primary and only necessary encounter. It's a sensual thrumming experience. And the problem is, though, that our medium is language. And language, though every word makes a sound, the sounds of words are immediately overwhelmed by meaning. And the meanings of most words are not innately sensual. We are creating sensual objects out of a medium that is constantly struggling against us. I know I made I was going to say implicit, it's not, it's sort of an explicit criticism of how literature's taught some. I mean, come on, how many literature courses have people in this world encountered where, it's, you engage in what does this story mean? And everybody understands the answer to the meaning of this story is an abstraction, is critical thought and engagement in theory and so forth. Even worse, what is the author trying to say? Trying. Hasn't said it yet. Whatever aesthetic response you've had, the author hasn't said what he's trying to say. That comes only when it turns into abstract thought. That's not what it's about. Now, those classes are necessary and enormously useful, but only with two things attached to them. It seems to me that every literature course that's going to do that, and should, and I admire them and respect them, I've learned from them, but here's how. With the first declaration at Listen class, what we're going to do this semester is a secondary and artificial thing. Don't confuse this with the actual reading experience of a work of art. But we're going to do this secondary and artificial thing, and we should, in order to tune up the instrument inside you which thrums. We may add some new strings in the upper and lower register. We'll tune all the other strings up to perfect pitch, so that when you leave this class and encounter another work of literary art, you will thrum more harmoniously and completely to it. That's why what we're doing is useful and good and important. Okay? But then, to complete the appropriate pedagogy here, it seems to me, there has to be a final assignment on the way out the door. And that is, all right, class, now that we've done this artificial and secondary thing to tune up your thrumming instrument, your final and most important assignment is this: forget everything we've said. Don't do this anymore. Because if you sit down with a work of literary art and you open the book, and as you read, part of you is going, what's he saying? What's the, I think I have just, it took a Catholic college for the electricity to be wired so that the heresy of what I'm saying here has been answered supernaturally. I'm sorry. But if you read the way we've talked, then what we've done is destroyed your ability to have an aesthetic response. And that's not how you encounter these works, you know? So that's got all that out of, what about smell in the titles, right? They are of the senses. Artists are not intellectuals. Artists are sensualists. And Vietnam, for me, when I've encountered Vietnam, and this is really a follow-on book to A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, which was a book of stories in the voices of Vietnamese people whose very identity has been shaped in Vietnam, who they knew they were. They've been exiled from that country into a foreign country, a new country where they have to reinvent who they are. They yearn for an identity, for a self. And yet, they have to do that in terms of who they were in Vietnam. Well, Perfume River is about that too. It's about Americans, however, not the Vietnamese. It's about people of my generation and maybe a little behind who are now exiled into another country, the country of incipient old age and intimations of mortality, who have to, because of being in that foreign country, are reassessing who they are. And they are coming to terms with the fact that who they are now in this country has been influenced by Vietnam. And that way, these two books are very much the same. And in both cases, Vietnam as an experience, the Perfume River itself is very important in this book. He goes to Hue, which is where the Perfume River is. He is part of that Tet Offensive in Hue. There are 6 main characters in this book, and all of them have been influenced by not only that war, but all war. I mean, his father is a World War II veteran who had a father who was a World War I veteran. Robert's grandson, and they go into the, well, you'll see. It stretches through all war too, but Vietnam in a matrix of sensual experience, the sense of smell was an important thing. I should teach you to ask a question. I tell you, 11 answers to one question. Yes. Thank you. Please. No. That, yeah, but we'll just forget it when we leave. That's all right.
But we've sort of alluded to this, but there had to be a motivation, a source of where all this came from. And I'm trying to explain the last part of your comment. It had to do with all the war and the element of Vietnam in that war. Clearly there was something in you that had to matter.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, how did it get in there and where did it go?
Okay. Sure. Did everybody hear most of that? Okay. Well, apropos of the answer to that is also apropos of the forgetting of something when you leave here. The great British novelist Graham Greene once said or wrote, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the quote, for a reason that will be immediately apparent. He said, all good novelists have bad memories. He says, what you remember comes out as journalism. What you forget goes into the compost of the imagination. And that's where the things you're asking about the source of, that's where they are. As I mentioned earlier, artists are sensualists. We live ravenously. I did not expect to go to Vietnam. I got gobbled up in a pre-lottery day draft and ended up signing on for an extra year so I didn't have to, like Robert didn't have to go into. I ended up in military intelligence in Vietnam, and they sent me to Vietnamese language school for a year before I went over. I studied it full time. I spoke fluent Vietnamese for my first day in country. I spent 5 months working out in the countryside. I fell madly in love instantly with the Vietnamese people and their culture and their landscape and their language. I had very close contacts for 5 months with Vietnamese farmers and woodcutters and fishermen and provincial police chiefs, and then I was transferred for the last 7 months into Saigon, where I worked in a civilian closed job at Saigon City Hall as the translator and administrative assistant to an American Foreign Service officer who was the advisor to the mayor of Saigon. And from this old French hotel, every night after midnight, for 7 months, I would wander alone into the steamy back alleys of Saigon where nobody ever seemed to sleep, and crouch in the doorways with people and talk to them in Vietnamese. And they were thrilled that I spoke their language. And they're, as a people, they are amongst the most warm and generous spirited in the world. And they invited me invariably into their homes and into their culture and into their lives. So I immersed myself in all of that. And you know, that's where all of that began. And then there's been a lot of living since then, and before then too, actually. You know, and so all of that stuff, and I got a really bad memory, a good bad memory. So all of that stuff is just composted. The characters and the stories that come out, I cannot, you know, I may eventually recognize in some large sense places I've been, but there's not a single character I could identify as somebody I knew in life as that person. And the sensual detail that emerges is detail that I don't remember remembering. And maybe I haven't remembered it. It's all something else. So that's how that works. Yes? How did the experience after I got back from the war, what? How did the experience when I got back from the war translate into a novel? Well, the translation was that composting. As a matter of fact, well, the first really good novel I wrote badly for a long time. I was kind of an autodidact. I wanted to be an actor when I was young. I went to Northwestern University, some success my first couple of years. Ended up deciding I wanted to write rather than act. Went into playwriting, went to the University of Iowa, got a master's degree in playwriting. I was a terrible playwright. And my most impassioned writing, I should have known better, my most impassioned writing was going into the stage directions. That's a very bad sign for a playwright. That is a closeted fiction writer is what that is. And then I wrote, but once I realized I was a fiction writer, I wrote, and I've got an exact count because my graduate students helped me organize my papers. I wrote 44 over the next decade or more, 44 dreadful short stories, unpublished, and 5, count them, 5 terrible novels, 1 million words of, and not to mention a dozen awful full-length plays, 1 million words of dreck, and before I started writing well, all right? So by the time I wrote my first really good book, and that stuff hadn't composted properly, and I didn't have myself to advise me, so I didn't know what I was really looking for in myself. And my first really good book was published in 1981. Now that was 9 years after I was in Vietnam. I wrote it, 7 years after I was in Vietnam. My Pulitzer book, where I wrote in the voices of Vietnamese people, I didn't write until 18 years after Vietnam. I moved to Tallahassee in the year in May of 2000, and I just wrote The Perfume River this past year, and that's the first book I've written set in Tallahassee. So how did it become a novel after I got back? It took time to settle out of my literal memory and into that compost heap. Literal memory you don't write from as a fiction writer. So, you know, it was simply a matter of time, and of course more living. I've had a lot of, you know, experiences in my life. Yes, sir.
Somebody whose name I don't remember said that if he doesn't write the work, it writes him.
Yeah.
Is that any truth to that comment?
Yeah, he I don't know who said that either. It sounds sort of familiar that he doesn't write the work, it writes him. Yeah, I mean, that's the feeling you have. Other people say it different ways. There's almost a feeling at times that you're just channeling it. Yeah. Exactly. That's how it feels. Yes.
You seem to emphasize like that when you're writing, you really desire for your writing to come to a very like romantic, sensual kind of place.
Uh-huh.
And I've noticed that when I read other authors' work, particularly when it's centered around Vietnam, like Quinoa, it seems very visually graphic. And I was wondering if you think that's because of my education, no offense, outside the country, or if you notice that as well, like if you think that other writers don't agree with your sensual.
I'll turn that camera off. I think you're a very astute reader. Next question. Yes.
You talk a lot about your experiences in the lessons in the other day, but in a way, everyone was there. You talk about looking inside yourself into the boiling, white hot pit of fear.
Your white hot center is the phrase I use often to say, as a kind of alternate way of talking about the unconscious, the dream space, which is, yeah, where you write from, right?
In snow, especially, your characters just seem so authentic, and for me, especially getting my characters to seem authentic is what I struggle with the most. And I know there's not characters anything like you. How do you?
No, I know. Yeah, and look, you start close to yourself. That was part of the 18-year gap. Snow was in the book that I started writing 18 years after I was back from Vietnam. The thing about the unconscious is you must, my first 5 really good books were written with characters at the center who were much closer to who I was whenever. I didn't start writing outside of my demographic, ugly word, but you know what I mean. The thing about the artistic unconscious is that you cannot authentically enter into the unconscious of the other until you are a master of who you most particularly and specifically are. The great thing that you wait for, you hope for, and eventually might come is that if you really do, and Akira Kurosawa, the great Japanese film director, once said, to be an artist means never to avert your eyes. And the place you have to go is scary as hell. And so if you go there, you write every day, story after story, book after book, going into that white hot center, facing it without averting your eyes. If you do that, and story after story, book after book, eventually you can break through to a place that, well, Jung called the collective unconscious. I think you can break through to a place where you are truly in touch with, having traveled there through your own profound particularity of who you are specifically, and ravenously living and being empathetic with the other, the many others. You can break through to a place where you're neither male or female, you're not white, brown, yellow, or red, you're not Christian, Muslim, Hindu, or Sikh, you're not male or female, you are human. That you can access as an artist. Part of your inspiration, part of the channeling has to do with being receptive to and open to the, because those things, and that, I mean, artists are in the business of defying political correctness in the most profound and compassionate and beautiful way. That beneath the thing that seems to make us all so different, the color of our skin, our gender, our ethnicity, our religion, our politics, all the stuff that divides us is not nearly as important or strong or profound as the thing that joins every one of us, which is our shared human condition. And the fact that each of us every morning wakes up and we look in the mirror and you go, who the hell are you? We share the yearning of identity and self. Who am I? And all those things I just mentioned, all the things that seem so profoundly to divide us, they are attempts to I say, well, this is who I am. And if I am this, and I'm identifying with one of those more shallow things, if I'm this, then the other is not me. And that, and a lot of, sad to say, it's a profound human feeling. A lot of folks identifying ourselves in one surface way will draw strength from not only being not the other, but being superior to the other. It's one of the, you know, the most profound flaws in the human character. The artist's belief and goal is to create objects in which we can find that common ground that makes us all human in defiance of the things that seem to make us different. And the artist's gift is to get through to that place and to write from there. Should we end on that? If you have any of my books with you, I'd be happy to greatly increase their value. Thank you.
Okay, same here. See you tomorrow. Oh, no problem, Margaret. Okay.
Come on, folks. How you doing? Good. Who are you?
My name is Samara.
Can you give me the spelling? Just a minute.